Okay, in this video, we're going to be basically looking at the different threats out there as violence from the idea of homeland security. Now, there have obviously been what are called people trying to downplay the idea of domestic threats and homeland security for political reasons on the right because it ends up negatively impacting them. And people are trying to basically say that there are what are called that these groups are peaceful and all these other things when frankly this is not the case. We've obviously seen this. And what we need to do is analyze the whole thing from what type of groups out there represent some type of national security threat and what they actually what their actual focus is on and what incidental actions happen from their focus, and in addition to their main focus of what they're trying to do. And when we start to look at this, you're going to see that what ends up coming on it with it, you'll see that there's going to be a different approach on these groups. Or ideologies, I should say as well. When we start to see these, you're going to actually see that there's this is why there needs to be a different approach to these ones out there, and people are going to and this is going to get people obviously on the right that are going to be angry with me, but the fact is we need to look at these things rationally and not just basically on their little bubble of right-wing media which wants to blame everything on the left, or obviously from the left wanting to bring everything against the right. We want to basically look at things validly. Now, from the idea of when it comes down to actual threats, from the aspect of homeland security, we want to actually look at things rationally and say that for the idea for the actually for foreign entities to actually provide an actual violent threat, they would end up causing death or injury. This is not rational. This has been proven in many occasions that this is not an actual rational fear, and we need to actually treat it as thus. So that means when we're dealing with national security, we should not put any focus, or actually I should say like a homeland security, we should not be putting much of a focus on these things. Keep an eye out on intelligence with it, but most of what ends up happening with what we see with a lot of foreign entities is they're trying to do what would be considered on the idea of cyber crimes. Cyber crimes are far more effective. They don't have to leave their home countries, and this is going to be the most effective for them. For them to actually physically leave their country and come here and actually enter here, it would be far too expensive. That's why these ideas of people saying, oh, but they can come to the southern border and come over here with it, that's far too expensive. There's nobody in Mexico that actually wants to do any type of terrorist act with it. The most that they would actually want to do is sell drugs on the market. And if you want to actually solve that problem, you can actually end the war on drugs, which is going to actually put it under the actual market prices as opposed to the black market prices, which are actually jacking up the actual cost, and that would actually make it less profitable for them. And because the whole large supply chain is going to make things where each party is going to want more money, and it's going to make it less likely that that certain things that have to be moving from outside the country are going to be moving in. So it's either A, going to raise the price of these goods. These prices of these goods are going to fall with it, where it becomes less and less profitable, and most likely these things are going to drop off the market. Or B, what's going to happen is that when they do hit with it, there's going to be no violence occurring from these groups because there's no reason to fight because these things are legal, because you're ending every obstacle, and you can bring these things to market as you would corn or wheat or any other type of commodity out there. And merely it would just be considered as no other different product on the market. And this is why if government got out of the way with it, that they wouldn't, and this war on drugs, you would not have this problem. And when it comes, and we're actually have, and I'll probably do another video on prohibition probably end up tomorrow with it, and the overall prohibition and why it causes issues with it. And this is actually going to be going over the idea of whenever you create a black market on anything, you're going to create a huge issue. And this is something in which we're finding that both the Democrats and Republicans are equally guilty of. But when we go back to this, with it, we're looking at the actual thing of what's actually risk, and what the government needs to do is look at risk assessment. Now, basically, when it comes to any foreign entity, I don't like to use the word actor because it looks like you're downplaying the actual threat and you're trying to make things into a damn game. When it comes down to these issues with it, you don't want to relegate the thing into a damn game with it, because that's where we have the things where people are using drones to kill people overseas and basically elevating war into pretty much a video game. And this is where we have our actual problems where we get blowback in our actual country. That's where we're getting part of the escalation, and why we're getting people that are not exactly positive on the United States, as well as certain other Western countries. Not necessarily that this is they hate freedom. No, they actually hate our actions, our foreign policy actions. Now, going back to this with it, so what they'll end up doing is they're more likely to actually defend themselves over there and attack us over there, because it's far more effective now. The idea of basically attacking us here with it when we're already paranoid here would be erroneous, because we've already basically essentially damaged ourselves, and we've done everything to leave ourselves vulnerable to everything domestic issues. And this is where our problem has come from. And we can actually have domestic issues throughout the whole country. And this is where we get intelligence that actually has downplayed things and want to say, oh, these are just lone wolf attacks. They're not lone wolf attacks. They're actually collaborated across the country. We've seen these type of things we're saying, but they will say lone wolf attack, or these weren't pre-planned, and it's basically trying to conceal their sins. Doesn't matter what type of attack it is. And what we need to do is we need to look and we need to say the obvious, that these are the most common attacks you're going to find. Whether it be for religious reasons, whether it be for political reasons, these are going to be your attacks with it. It isn't internationally organized. It's domestically organized, and this is what's happening. And what ends up happening right now with it is, just because within population numbers, we need to understand that religious-based crime is not a very high factor. It very rarely happens, and it's pretty well apparent when it's going to happen, and you just have to kind of be aware of when it's going to occur. And these things very rarely happen, if ever. Doesn't matter across the board whether there's crimes that are happening across the board with these things on a religious basis. Doesn't matter what religion we're talking about, and we're fine. But because the media wants to focus on Islam, Islam tends to be the most focused on religion. And this is something in which we find that people are actually focusing on them because of this fact. Ever since the 9/11 attacks, with it, they want to focus on that and put all of their effort. Now, this is actually a very, very poor decision on the Homeland Security. The Homeland Security basically has this things of thinking that these are cases, and then they always want to put on a lone wolf attack because they were never actually watching out for any of these things, watching out for any of these signs. So they always want to plan it out as a lone wolf attack. Meanwhile, these things were actually pre-planned. Many times they're actually small little groups that were actually planning them as well. And they don't actually want to actually investigate these things beyond that, and because it might actually showcase failures within their own system and showcase that civilian intelligence doesn't work. Now, when we look at the idea of what other types of things within it is, being that what I call religious ones are not major ones, we need to look at what actually are the other ones that actually happen. These are basically political. It doesn't matter if we're talking environmental or if we're talking based on supporting a political ideology directly. And the major two tend to be people fighting on the ideas of two authoritarian ideologies. This is either socialism or nationalism, and these are the ones out there with it. Now, we end up having, the socialist groups are far smaller cells with it, and they're fighting on their ideas of anti-fascism. And when it comes down to this we'll go over in a minute with it, what type of focus they have on it. When it comes to nationalism, they have far larger cells and are far more dangerous. Because of these far larger cells, they have not as many groups, but they have far larger spanning groups that are across the country, and these groups are far well organized. Instead of being groups of maybe 10 or 12 people at most, we're talking we're talking well into like the 4 digits, if not larger, for membership, 4 to 5 digits in membership, if not even 6 digits in membership when we talk about membership numbers. And when you get to that large, you're actually talking about something that's actually a credible threat. Some might even be talking on the level of like a 7-digit membership. We're talking that we might not know the exact number, because obviously they're not going to fully disclose that, because these groups are not going to want to basically cooperate with law enforcement. These are militant groups that are nationalist. They're not they've been erroneously described as anti-government. They're not anti-government. Trust me about that. That would be anarchist. They're not anarchist groups. These are very much pro-government groups. They're just nationalist. This means they're authoritarian. They basically want what they basically want is a military dictatorship. And this is basically what they're pushing for. And we've seen their different ideologies of what they want, and this is something in which is highly, highly dangerous, being that they're larger cells and reach from areas from the West Coast to the East Coast, from as far down as Southern California, from up north as far as Maine. We've seen these groups. Basically, you have Proud Boys, 3 Percenters, Oath Keepers. These are the groups that are actually out there doing this. These are basically militant nationalist groups. Calling them anti-government is, as I've said, is erroneous. They don't believe against the government. they they portray themselves as so-called upholding the Constitution, and they're not. They don't believe in the Constitution. As we've seen in each one of these groups, they're nationalists. They don't actually believe in anything of the actual Constitution. They actually believe in only pieces of it. They would defend themselves, but when it comes to everything else with it, they actually want to eliminate those pieces because it would be damaging to their movement. Such as one of the things with it is they don't want to actually admit that there is no actual government authority on immigration. No, none of one of these groups want to actually admit that. Now, this is actually a tenet that we're finding in both political parties, because we find them wanting to go into some type of comprehensive immigration reform when they can merely just go to the Supreme Court and say, the word immigration never appears once in the Constitution, and claiming that the Commerce Clause gives authority over immigration is erroneous, because it only gives the authority for goods to exchange from place to place. And to assume this, you'd have to assume that immigrants are either goods or services, even in the widest span. They could essentially go to that idea and say the Commerce Department currently with it is not having any dealings with immigration whatsoever, and has never dealt with immigration whatsoever. Merely just write this out in an actual memo. And that would, in theory, with it, say that they do not want any dealings with immigration. This would, in theory, strip the bind between immigration and the Commerce Clause, which is basically how they do it. They could even do the same thing for the war on drugs. All the things that are basically done with it, they're trying to use the Commerce Clause as some type of ability for federal authority. Meanwhile, with it, they've essentially viewed the Constitution in a backwards event, basically saying that, well, if it's not listed in the Constitution, it means the federal government has authority over it. Well, in fact, that's exactly backwards. If the Constitution does not list that authority there, it means that authority, as the 10th Amendment states, is reserved to the states of the people. Now, we obviously know that the states do not have authority over immigration. They cannot actually restrict people going from state to state. If someone were to basically become a citizen going from immigrant and get naturalization in one state with it, you could not have another state say you're not welcome here. That would be illegal, because of the way the whole union must be set up with it. So we know that the states do not have, because essentially within the states you need essentially, we've adopted essentially open borders within states. And because of this, that's because of the Commerce Clause itself. And that means within the actual states, that the states theoretically have no authority over immigration. The local municipalities actually, because the states have no authority, they actually have no authority to do so, because their legal authority would actually be of no bounds, because they would have to abide by the state constitution. And the state constitution states that this power technically would go to the people. Guess what? There is no actual immigration power throughout the United States, and that's why our actual founders actually stated this, because they wanted the free movement of people. And this is why when we start to view some of these groups with it, they're merely they're merely trying to basically hold back the idea of the government getting further, at least on the personal liberty side, getting further to what the founders had instructed. Because the left is, at least that's one thing the left does right. Now the right doesn't, the right is weak on everything. And for those who think the right's good on these nationalist right wingers are good on anything, no, they're what I call they support they historically with the right was at least what I call in the past good on trying to stop gun control. Well, guess what? With the right under Donald Trump was trying to pass gun control through executive order. This is something which was equal to what you would find out of the left wing. And frankly, the only time that you would find getting rid of gun control is basically through the court system now. And basically, beyond judges, you basically have no allies in the beyond judges and local offices filled by libertarians. You're not going to find any allies for the Second Amendment. Libertarians are going to be your only allies for actually following the Constitution. But they've only been filling up local offices, and they actually got quite a few gains in this past election for the reason that people are actually sick of the GOP. And in certain other areas, it's because they're sick of Democrats as well. And it's probably going to expand with it as the Republicans start to bury themselves even further. Now, when we start to look at, now we need to go into what actually happens in the actual damage that actually occurs into the types of damage that are happening from both Antifa and these socialist groups and these nationalist groups on these multiple Antifa groups that are basically about, which as Antifa being an idea with it. So these actual small groups, I mean, it would take me a million years to basically name every one of them. You'd have to keep going on and on and on and on and on with it. So basically naming, so we'll just basically talk about the idea with it and what actually happens with it. Now people want to blame Black Lives Matter with it in it, but Black Lives Matters really has gotten some of their stuff co-opted by a political part within the political part is actually kind of grouping in with these Antifa people. Now there's a difference between political Antifa and actually the Antifa movement in itself. Political Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter in the movement itself. And that's why there's a big difference. The actual movement in itself with it is far different. They're actually pushing for actual justice and for criminal justice reform. And what the right is trying to do is blur these lines. Now, there's obviously people who are trying to get money from this, and those are people on the political end who are trying to push Marxist ideas, and this really has nothing to do with the movement. And this is a complete different thing that we find out there. That's why there's a political end and an actual social end. The social end is completely different and very much devoid of it. But what we find with the right is the right's trying to cloud the mix between the two, between a handful of people who are trying to create this idea of Black Lives Matter as the political end and the social end as being the same thing. Now, the political end is basically just a handful of people that are basically just trying to capitalize on the movement to basically that's meant for criminal justice reform and trying to get other things as well that do not apply and are basically just Marxist ideas. Now, when we start to look at at what ends up happening in these things, even in the worst case scenarios. Now, the worst case scenario is what's actually happening in these events, even when you have the small Antifa groups taking over, is property damage. In what are called, in rare occasions, we're having violence and we've had small amounts of we're talking all events total of handful of homicides that have actually occurred. But what's actually happening with it is basically the actual thing at worst with it is we're saying with these movements is at worst the whole thing is that the focus would be property damage, and any type of physical damage is merely incidental. This would mean that basically the best solution for this would be local police to handle the idea of property damage and arrest those who are actually involved in these problems. Had the insurance companies deal with it, and the insurance companies basically start to process these issues and potentially find some type of civil ability to process these things with it, potentially process the groups involved for the involvement in them, if they're what it calls, if these people are, find the people that they're directly involved with, if there's some type of coordination to actually cause these things and cause these damages to these businesses or residences. And if there are if there's any of these activist people that are trying to stir things up that end up causing these things to blow up, such as these nationalist activists that end up causing these things to blow up with it, maybe charging one or two of these people with civil liability on these cases, and having them be responsible for the actions that are actually occurring with it, with them basically trying to create the confrontation that ends up leading to everything with it, essentially charge them with starting a riot and charge them with basically any civil damages from that, such as Annie No and people of this group. And this would be something we can actually look into doing, because obviously we know that he is not an actual journalist. He is actually an activist. There's other ones within his type of little group that are these nationalist activists. They're actually trying to actually incite violence. Then when it comes down to where it creates a riot, he and his other little cohorts end up taking video so they can get onto Fox News, become viral, and they sell off the video and they get wealth off of it. And they complain about, oh my God, I got hurt because they were they attacked me for actually inciting something. Never mentioning that they incited something in the first place. And when we start to view like the other side, we end up seeing that basically is when they're causing things is these are so when we view this idea of property crime, what's actually happening is traditionally when we see property crime, these usually end up being spur of the moment, something that was incited and something that ended up blowing up. And that's not exactly, property crime doesn't get pre-planned. It's not something that's planned in advance. Usually when you see stuff that's high levels of violent crime, those are things that are actually pre-planned events that are actually meant to go after and try to kill people. This is completely different when we're talking about these nationalist groups. And we've even seen not only these nationalist groups, but also politicians associated with them, such as white nationalist Paul Gosar. And people are going to say, oh, you can't call him that with it. Yes, I can with it, because he's actually associated himself with white nationalist political action committees as well with it, or political action conferences as well, that he had no problem speaking at, that are talking about excessively racist things with it. And when it comes down to it, is these are basic things with it that he's actually run his campaigns on, and he's considered to be one of the most extremist members. He's spoken at the same types of things that Steve King has spoken at, the same conference that Steve King spoke at, and Steve King is a noted white nationalist. And the fact is when we're talking about that, if he's doing that with it, that sorry, but you know what the association is going to be doing with it. And if you have no problem with that, and not only do you do it once, but multiple times, you know what the association is going to be. And that means you have no problem, not only are aware of the association that's going to be put onto you, you have no problem taking that label. And that means the label is going to be apt and is going to be applied to you, and you have no problem with that application. So I have no problem using that application on him, because apparently he has no problem taking the application of that label. And when it comes down to it, is that we've seen him basically finding that he had coordination with a lot of these, with different groups, to basically coordinate with them to not only do it on the January 6th, but also to do it in other, to work to attack even in Arizona to stop the counting of their ballots there. And we don't know how many of these other psychopaths actually like that actually did this in other areas across the nation. Now, these are serious people that are actually a serious this is why nationalism is a serious threat. We have other people that are basically calling for a military coup, such as General Flynn, and these are where you get these other ones. But this is why these nationalist groups are a serious threat to the country. And this is why, when it comes down to it, why these ones are far different. Now, when we look at these nationalist groups with it, their actual focus is not property damage. Property damage is basically incidental. It's going to happen from any of the actions that they do. They understand this with it, but this is not their focus whatsoever. Their focus is casualties. They want injuries and they want death. This is their only focus on when they're doing their little actions. This means that they have these things, but this means these are actually pre-planned. And as we've seen in emails, and as we've seen in other contexts on social media, these things are well pre-planned. Not like a couple of weeks in advance. We're talking months in advance. And this is where we found that basically that a lot of these things are well planned in advance, and it's likely that even the White House itself was basically trying to create cover for these groups, as a lot of people were stating that Trump did not wanted actually to use the National Guard to protect the insurrectionists at the Capitol on January 6th, not to actually stop them. And the reason why, obviously, we see that why he never did the Insurrection Act is you'll see very, very simple. Is you'll actually you'll find very, very simple with it why he never did it. And this is something, it's very, very simple with it. And it's lays out very simple with it. It's basically the Insurrection Act of 1807 isn't United States federal law that empowers the President of the United States to deploy U.S. military and federalized National Guard troops within the United States in particular circumstances, such as to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, and rebellion. That would theoretically, it would not stop any transition of power, but rather essentially the only thing he could do is sic these on his supporters. This is why he never actually went through with the Insurrection Act as his supporters asked. So if his supporters actually wanted him to go through with this, that would essentially, all that would have done was after January 6th, all they could have done is basically gone after and started arresting a bunch of his supporters that have actually members that and actually advisors of his that are actually calling for the overthrow of the government. They would essentially, all that would have done is they would have actually essentially gone against his actual interest. That's why he never did that. And that's why when we look at these national security concerns with it, nationalism is a serious concern, because if you have a president right there that's actually doing it now, essentially Biden could theoretically call for the Insurrection Act right now if he wanted to, and essentially say, we're going to round up all these psychopaths and we're just going to round them up right now, throw them all in jail. Anybody who actually supports the idea of overthrowing the country is gone. Anybody who says the election was not valid with it after Trump went through all of his process with it, any politician who does the exact same thing is out of here. It does not matter with it. Anybody who basically goes with these ideas is perpetuating the big lie with it. Anybody who gives any support to these people who attacked the Capitol is gone, out in jail. And he would theoretically be fully empowered to actually do this. There's nothing theoretically unconstitutional about this. Yes, it's what it called theoretically. Yes, it would theoretically be suspending a lot of current law with it, but and he's held back from doing this, and he's actually shown a lot of restraint by doing this. And for those people who don't think those who think he's some type of tyrant, no, he's not. He's not he's not using the Insurrection Act to basically lock up anyone who's actually calling for basically violent rebellion against the country because they didn't like the outcome of an election. And basically he could essentially round up basically pretty much anybody who has a Trump flag in their front yard. Theoretically, he would actually have legitimacy to actually round them up. And this was essentially theoretically what he would do, because they would be viewed as a serious national security threat, as domestic terrorists, as we've seen with it, because when we look at the actual cases, there is no actual legitimacy when it comes to actually foreign attacks on the nation, but there have been plenty of instances of domestic attacks on the nation. And this would be far more, and it's far more prevalent. There's usually, what most people don't pay attention to, there's usually multiple cases of these events on a yearly basis, doesn't matter what the president is, when we look at domestic attacks on the nation for political reasons. When it comes down to foreign attacks, it's been exceedingly rare. And that's why the expectation of that. And the ideas with this should be we should be far more open to looking at these ideologies of it. And when it comes down to these things, is you're not finding people from libertarian groups, you're not finding people from even left-wing groups that are actually engaging in these things. you're actually finding these are all right-wing groups with it that are national, as obviously they would be a nationalist. So nationalism is not only is a serious threat, but always has been a serious threat in this country, because they're the first ones to engage in violence, because they'll proclaim that they're trying to protect individual liberty, but they're the first ones to actually violate other people's individual liberty because they want some type of military dictatorship. And this is something which is very important to examine when we start to look at these groups. And that's why when we start to see with the right wing, they want to change the subject, because they don't want to actually look at what would be better handled by local police when it comes to property crimes, and not look at serious things that have been serious threats for decades when it comes to other issues. Now, yes, we also have the government being abusive with it by not actually following the Constitution. This is the problem of both Democrats and Republicans that have slid the bar far where it needs to be with it, where Democrats trying to be what I call bipartisan have allowed personal liberty to slip, and by Republicans naturally doing it as well, and by both parties basically supporting this guns and butter economy. And we've had our Constitution eroded at massive levels over the last 140 years, where they've added powers that don't exist by trying to claim that these things are under the Commerce Clause, or by saying that, well, the executive can do this and this and this with it, when it never even explains that in the Constitution, that the things with it. And they're trying to say, well, and they're trying to basically add powers that aren't even in the Constitution. The executive is merely to enforce the laws. That's it. To enforce the laws that are constitutional. That's it. Nothing more. When it comes to, if they want to change something, they need to go through the amendment process, which requires the states. They want to amend anything. If they actually want to add immigration law to the Constitution, they need to go with an actual amendment. And guess what? You're probably not going to get it. And you would have probably never have gotten it in the first place. That's the whole point with it. That's why they've tried to basically say these things existed with it, because they knew they would never have gotten it in the first place. They would have never gotten it 140 years ago, and they would have never gotten it now. And so they make up powers that never exist. Basically going to cut it right here, and going to end it with this, and bye everyone.